how we see the journey that we've been on makes an enormous difference to what we see the challenges are today. And we won't all see it the same way. So this is very much my way of seeing the journey that we've been on. So I sometimes use this, a man at the bottom of a hole, he's just stopped digging. And this is to symbolise what I think is our real position. And it's to stand in opposition to, you know that phrase, standing on the shoulders of giants, which we quite often use. And there is a tendency in modern society to always assume progress, to always assume that things have been getting better and better, and we're always on that kind of dynamic. It's a very natural human thing. But it's worthwhile remembering that as far as people with disabilities are concerned, and particularly people with learning difficulties, and also many people with mental health problems, we're just coming out of, and how far I think is a big question, we're coming out of 100 or so years where we've just done dreadful, dreadful things to people. Dreadful thing. And in a way, our great achievement, if we can call it that, is we've stopped doing dreadful things. We stopped building huge institutions, although we seem capable of building small institutions. You know, we're not sending kids to long-stay institutions in the same way that we were only 40 years ago. So this slide is meant to represent for us a sense that, you know, what we should remember is that if we're not standing on the shoulders of giants, if we just stopped doing really dopey, terrible things, then our knowledge base is very, very poor. To realise you've been doing something wrong for a long time and to stop doing it is an achievement, but it's not a great, I think, professionals, and I include myself, we do have a tendency to want to be on the end of a good news story where we've learnt lots of stuff, and now as a professional I'm going to do the new set of really exciting, positive things. I've got the new good idea. I've got the answer in my pocket. Here it is. It might be called personalisation. It might be called self-directed support. It might be called supported living. We have a lot of these things in our pockets. I've produced a few in my time. Yes? But really, all we're doing is waking up to the fact that we've been doing things wrong. Which is something. So, for me, I think that for most of the 19th century, for most of the 20th century, the people I care about most, people with learning difficulties, have really not been treated as equal citizens at all. They have been treated primarily as subhuman, non-citizens, or at best second-class citizens. And that process of dehumanisation really reached its peak in Nazi Germany. I was really a bit shocked during the Olympics. I don't know if anybody else watched the opening programme of the Olympics, but there was a documentary about eugenics, and it mentioned race and the Jewish people, of course, and other groups. The one group it never mentioned in this documentary was disabled people. Not mentioned at all. And yet 250,000 disabled people were killed by Hitler and by physicians working for Nazi Germany. These were not just one thing going on at the same time as the Holocaust. These were the first step in the Holocaust. And it wasn't even Hitler's idea, you know. This is what is... He was lobbied by physicians and others who were saying to him, the eugenics movement in Germany isn't keeping pace with the eugenics movement in the US, the UK and Sweden. We need to go further and faster. They're doing mass sterilizations. We need to bring in euthanasia. This is what professionals were lobbying for in the 1930s. And these are just some of the kind of euthanasia centres that were set up. But they weren't set up afresh, of course. They were just the institutions where people were placed were turned into euthanasia centres. And in fact, the first gas chambers for the Jews were the gas chambers that were no longer required for disabled people. They were dismantled, and doctors and nurses took them and set them up to be used for the Jews. I'm not going to go on and on about this stuff that's quite depressing. I've written a lot about this. If people are interested, there's books available as an e-book. I want to use this, however, to think about this process of dehumanisation. what can we learn from it if we're honest? If you really try and work out what was going on, what allowed people to behave so viciously, what allowed people to do things that might now seem outrageous, but at that point in time didn't seem that outrageous. I mean, there were groups, the Catholic Church lobbied against what was going on, but many parts of civilised Germany as it was then, as in its own mind at least, were quite happy with this strategy of getting rid of these undesirable, worthless lives. One of the factors that encouraged this thinking was this view that individual life didn't really matter. There was no notion of individual rights. Instead, it was about the race, the people, the folk. There was not a strong sense of the sacred worth of each individual life. People were also in a situation economically which was reaching a particular crescendo in the 1920s and 1930s, a feeling of rootlessness, a feeling of deep insecurity about your economic situation. Money didn't seem to have, the famous German inflation, but this was again a worldwide phenomenon, but was particularly concentrated in Germany, where unemployment meant that people really lost all stake in the world, couldn't rely on anything. Very useful at times like this to have scapegoats. We've seen during the 20th century also a huge increase in the power of the state, in a way that is without. You'd have to go back to the pharaohs of Egypt, really, to find kind of structures of state power that were so enormous, where the state was controlling such a high degree of the economy. Scapegoating, people familiar with the history will know the kind of scapegoating that went on about the Jewish people, but it's interesting to notice that the same kind of stereotypes that existed around the Jewish people also existed around disabled people. Differences, of course, but the same kind of venomous language, the way in which people were treated as threats, or children, or viruses, all of this language, lives without real value. The three final steps in dehumanisation are also particularly interesting. What Hitler had to do over a period of nearly 10 years to the Jewish people was rob them of formal rights, rob them of economic power, and segregate them in ghettos. And it took nearly 10 years to achieve that. That had already been achieved for disabled people. The people that were murdered in the euthanasia program were already lacking in formal rights, already lacking in economic power, and already lacking in physical presence, because they were inside the institution. And that experience was, of course, one of the factors that gave rise to the human rights movement. It's one of the factors that allowed people to start challenging the language of euthanasia and eugenics, which had dominated professional thinking about people with disabilities. I would question how far and how deep our thinking has changed, but certainly our thinking has changed somewhat. As I say, the journey away from the institutions wasn't very rapid, however. The peak population of the institutions in the United Kingdom was the late 1970s, and you will find institutions all around the world still, in developed countries particularly, and you will find that in many places deinstitutionalisation still hasn't even really begun. A picture I took maybe 15 years ago, but it's quite a poignant image for me of the institution. This is from St Ebba's Hospital in outward from the institution. That little white line. For some reason they painted a white line right round St Ebba's. Who was that for? It can only be for the community. It's to say to people in the community, you don't want to cross this white line, do you? This is a different kind of place. This is not community. And yet now we can see just a few yards away, ordinary semi-detached houses in an ordinary housing estate that had actually grown up from London around the institutions. And what happened as the institutions were closed, one of the things that's really striking is that the way money was spent is very, very limited. The variety of ways in which it's spent is very limited. I mean, this is from Lancashire, and Lancashire had a reputation for being one of the most go-ahead, forward-thinking local authorities in the era of deinstitutionalisation. And yet, most of the money is spent on group homes, institutional units, and day centres. Yeah? So you've got all these other services that may or may not sound nice to you, But really what it boils down to is putting people in groups, putting people in day centres, and if that person's too problematic, we put them in an institutional unit somewhere else. If you analyse that money in a different way, you know, what of that money is helping people engage in community, and what of that money is just paying for people to be in segregated services? 92% of that funding is in segregated services. This is not long ago. I took this data, it was about 10 years old. And not lots changed in my experience. So I don't know what Gloucestershire looks like today, but this was in supposedly one of the better local authorities. This is data on where people with learning difficulties live. The green is living with parents, yellow living with other relatives, blue living on your own, pink living with a partner, red supported accommodation. They're group homes, largely. When we look at those, the blue is living with 4 or less people, yellow is living with between 10 and 5 people, and red is living with more than 10 people. It seems to me that all we did when we closed the institution was reopen it in the community without the park. Now that might seem really a horrible thing to say, but I think if you look at how the money's spent, if you look at how people's lives often work, this is the reality of what the professional system does. Now, many people with learning difficulties and their families fought for and organised different things, and some people got a much better deal, and some people went on and did interesting things. So, you know, there's many successes in that. But if we're really talking about, you know, a systemic change from the institution to something that got named community care, it doesn't look like a great success. I mean, the other thing I'd say about that slide, which we can come back to, is that's the government spending people's money for them on things they wouldn't buy for themselves. Because when we did give people control, this isn't what they did. The journey from the institution to community has not been straightforward. What people found is that the commitments and organisation and funding created new barriers for people in terms of building good community lives themselves. But people have innovated and come up with different ways, different solutions. And I bet many of you in this room today are actively involved in some of the things that are on my little tree picture. And this tree is just meant to represent 2 or 3 things. One is, in the top, in the branches, and the fruit of the tree, if you like, are lots of different social innovations. It does strike me as interesting, and we might come back to this, that all of them, and several of them I've named, so I'm to blame, but they all have pretty poncy names, don't they? From, you know, self-directed support, supported living, person-centred planning, asset-based community development. I can stick up for all these things, but it is kind of a peculiarity that they all have quite odd names, and it's interesting to think about what function that jargon is serving in our story. What's also interesting is if you know the history of any of those things, the history of person-centred planning, the history of supported living, the history of self-directed support, not one of those things was invented by government. Not one of those things came out of government, certainly central government. All of those things were invented by people in communities, passionate about trying to get better lives for people. And all of them were informed to some degree, and I'm not saying in a straightforward way, I think it's a messy thing, theory and practice, but you know, you won't find many people who've developed those ideas in practice who won't talk in some way about people's rights, or about inclusion, or about community development, or about recovery, or about the social model, or even normalisation, or some of these kind of theories. So I think it's really important to pay attention to this, because in the way in which these systems then sometimes get rolled out, all of that background history goes missing in action, doesn't it? I mean, I don't know what you know about personal budgets, but for many people, it's another government idea that you were meant to be doing from 2007 onwards. But that's just something the government made up. That's its story. That's not what actually happened. And of course, when the government tells it its way, the connection between personal budgets and inclusion goes missing in action, doesn't it? Because this is just another system change. Yeah? We're now going to do personal budgets, folks. We're now going to chop the money up in these little bits, and you're going to have a resource allocation system, and you're going to have a support planning process. They're completely detached from the meaning and the purpose of the innovation itself. Supported living is another good example. I mean, I was on the group in '92 that Peter Kinsella set up to promote supported living in the United Kingdom. What were the principles? People have their own home that they choose. They choose who they live with. They choose who supports them. They can get rid of the supporters if they don't like them. Does that describe supported living as it now exists in England? Not sure. I sat at a conference recently of supported living providers, and I was hearing about residential care, just with new words. And that's what happens all the time, is that innovations just lose their meaning. So what we find is that the institution just doesn't, you can't just move away from it. A lot of the institution comes with us. And we can, the optimistic side is that we can figure out what to do about that. So I think, I'm not trying to suggest there's no success in closing long-stay institutions. It's really important to close long-stay institutions. It just turns out that what we replaced them with was a kind of new institutional arrangement, where people are surrounded by services. And we have figured out how to help people get out of that kind of service world by things like supported employment and genuine supported living and self-directed support to some degree. All of these are mechanisms by which people did and have achieved real citizenship, real control in their lives. Even then, however, we find that people are still caught in sometimes mad benefit systems and traps and all sorts of regulations that still control their lives unnecessarily. So that journey to full citizenship, that journey to creating a vibrant community is not straightforward. Welfare state for people with disabilities has been a good but mixed blessing. In a way, the welfare state took over the institutions and for several decades just carried on providing funding for them. It certainly is an essential mechanism for lifting people out of the kind of abject poverty that they would be left in if we left people to the markets or we just threw people to the wolves. So, in my view, having social mechanisms that protect people's income and give people real social rights is vital. But what we've discovered is that the social welfare state can both be manipulated so that it doesn't fully protect people's rights, and it is also today under radical attack. Radical attack. And the cuts that are currently happening and the reductions in people's human rights and the effective rights are targeted at disabled people. Again, people don't seem to recognise this, there's no discussion of this in the general media. It's an extraordinary state of affairs. Most citizens are going to confront between 2010 and 2015 cuts, largely in services, not incomes, equivalent to about £500, 546. But people with the severest disabilities, people who would be entitled to social care or are entitled to social care, are going to face cuts in services or income equivalent to over £10,000 a year. Almost a staggering amount of money. The people almost, when you give the facts, people just can't believe it. It just seems impossible to believe. But then go and look at what the government spending plans say. They say that the biggest cuts are going to be for English local government. What does English local government do? Social care. It's 60% of what local government really does is social care. So if you reduce funding from central government to local government, and local government has some funding of its own, but primarily relies on central government funding, by 42%, which is what's going on, then those cuts have to fall on social care. That's the biggest cut in percentage terms is to English local government. The biggest cut in cash terms is to benefits. Who gets benefits? People in poverty and disabled people. You know, because the benefits that are protected are pensions, of course. 80 billion of 180 billion is pensions, that's protected, that's going to grow. But the 20 billion has to come from the remaining 100. And that's really something that's much more important to these groups. Even worse, in a way, is the change in language. This is all going to seem very bleak. But I do think we have to be honest to what's going on here. We are moving back into a terrain where people are using the language of stigma and shame around disability. Look at these headlines. Are these familiar to you? These headlines are not just accidental products of peculiar right-wing newspapers. These are fed by government press releases. The 75% of incapacity claimants are fit to work was delivered the day after a DWP press release that set those figures up. And it's nonsense. You only get there by misunderstanding completely how the employment support allowance, one of the so-called welfare reforms, works. What actually happened is that the government decided as a matter of policy to divide all the people who were previously on incapacity benefit into 3 groups, about 50% of whom they said are fit to work. This is something they decided as policy, not because of any new medical finding. 25% they said, you know, moderate disability can work with support, and 25% really can't work. This is a policy decision. This is not a great discovery of scroungers or skivers, but that's not what it looks like up there, is it? So this is what we're dealing with. So that's quite enough bad news. We want to try and set out how challenging this time is. I do feel that we are at a point in our history where a kind of complacent assumption of ongoing progress is wrong. We cannot be complacent.